applications is that, you're really sort of thinking about personalization in a wholly different way. Like you're talking about personalization at that level of the person, right? So you're treating them as a human with an identity, with a voice, so you want to get that sort of alignment that within the system of change, like I think as Suzanne Gibbs Howard said, a few weeks back. Now, there's one example sort of I wanted to just throw in here, and that's from Cemex, which is a company that we work with. And so last summer we did a case study in a webinar with the head of their leadership development program, Claudia Della Torre Foglia, who's really been sort of a great purpose teacher for me, like really sort of walking me through sort of the mechanics of how you do this. And so they adopted a purpose in the last decade, right? They shifted to this purpose model. But one of the challenges they faced was, well, how do you push this through the organization? One of the tactics they took on that was sort of targeting those first-time managers as they're in these transitional moments, right? So it's moving to that new role and ultimately sort of pushing that change to the front lines, right? So, as we mentioned earlier, like they have this model in place, right? So it's hitting at the right time, but also they sort of have this, like their model is 4 parts, but, starts out with this investigation of the individual purpose, and then purpose within the team, how to connect to the organization, and then ultimately, how do you sort of connect to that wider ecosystem, right? Your suppliers, the environment, like, so it's creating those progressive connections, but ultimately it's about sort of, it starts with the person, and then the manager can help their reports discover their purpose. So it has this cascading effect that, while it may start with L&D, has sort of this self-perpetuating effect once it starts getting out into the organization.
It was, I thought, a wonderful comment, Stephen. Thank you for in the chat. You talk about channeling a bit of your John Cotter, first break all the rules. Gaining buy-in and building a guiding coalition is one of the biggest challenges. So, Chris, can I ask this of you? For folks that are a bit daunted by it on the L&D side, about how do they attach to it? Maybe are they looking at it in the wrong way? Have they maybe already begun?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that became very apparent to me through these conversations, and I was thinking about the whole conversation through the lens of the future of L&D, is the thing that became obvious to me is L&D teams are already playing in this space, whether they know it or not. They are a massive engine for perpetuating the culture of an organization. And if the culture of the organization is about doing required training and hitting your compliance metrics, which we know we all have to do, that's one thing. But if you think about your culture as helping people understand why the organization does what it does and how their personal purpose and goals can fit into that, that's a much higher order of work. And I think the opportunity to lean in and help with this whole purpose journey for L&D teams is absolutely massive. And there's a couple of things that I want to talk to. To me, at the end of the day, purpose is very, very much about culture. Why do we do what we do? And what do we consider success? At the very beginning, when we talked to Aaron Hurst, he said that he'd wished he'd called his book, which is called The Purpose Economy. He said he wished he'd called his book The Attention Economy, because it's really, for leaders and managers and business leaders, it's really about how do you galvanize people? How do you get people's attention on the things that matter to you as an organization? And so attention is a word that kind of sets off alarm bells for me, because that's the business we're in learning. We're getting people's attention. You need to pay attention if you want to learn. And so good L&D teams, are really all over that. So I think there is a natural alignment there between getting people's attention and then setting them free to explore and collaborate with across their teams to figure out what their personal purpose is and how that fits into the bigger journey of the organization. The very, very tangible, practical things that you can do as a learning leader to make this happen. And we heard several examples as we went through the conversations. It was pretty exciting.
Yeah, Chris, maybe I can pull the thread on that. I want to answer one of these questions live from Bianca Bettio. Talks about, poses the question, how can purpose help us build a culture of learning and development in organizations? Almost a little bit of sort of the inverted lens. I know we're going to get into a bit of the how to get started in a minute, but any early insights there? Or Stacia, if you wanted to weigh in on that one.
I want to just say something. This is really critical, because if you don't know why you're learning, if you don't know why you're engaging in these programs to either build more technical skills or build more human skills, then you're not going to be motivated to do it. And so I think that for me is a very, very clear linkage, a great question, and crystal clear alignment. It's like, understand why you offer these programs and tell people, and life will get a lot better. And by the way, you can stop doing things, a lot of things, if they don't fit in, if they don't answer that question of helping you as an organization achieve your purpose. I mean, it really is game-changing kind of thought process.
And then I would add in the component that is, while there's clearly some value in, a program on identifying your personal purpose and making the connection, et cetera. There's also the layer of this being a lens. So every, whether it's a learning program, whether it's an overall initiative, if it's just how you think about creating a learning culture, how does this connect back to purpose? Do we talk about purpose? Whether that's in your leadership development programs or maybe in a diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging program, whatever it is that you have going on, purpose should be woven into those programs. And I think, that is part of how you create the culture when it is just everywhere. You just bump into it. And so it comes back to you like, oh, this is just how we do things here. And that ultimately, right, is the definition of culture. This is how we do things here.
The real eye-opening one for me was the conversation that we had with Jeff Orlando from Medtronic, where he talked about the importance of ceremony. Right. And when you think about it, most L&D teams, they are really in charge of a lot of ceremony, whether it's the annual sales kickoff or it's the onboarding program where people spend their first day with you, or whether it's the transition into a management role, or whether it's kind of reflecting on leadership purpose. These are all moments that can be potentially harnessed to make very significant statements about purpose. And by the way, if you don't do that, you are doing that, right? Like by omission, it's also true.
By omission,
exactly.
Part of that.
But I think you can also use that mindset as a way to look at what you're doing now and see, can you make that more clear? So, you mentioned, Chris, I think one powerful one was the new manager training or, moving up on a level and whatever that is. And so, your purpose potentially as a new manager is potentially different, where you're maybe managing 3 to 5 people or something different than if you're a manager of managers. Like fundamentally your purpose in the organization and potentially your purpose in connecting with a broader group of people shifts. And so if you think, what is the purpose, what could be the purpose of this group of people coming together for this event? And are we allowing people to reflect on that and to connect this experience to that? I think that could make anything that you're doing much more powerful. Again, as long as you're bringing that purpose lens to whatever you already have going on.
Yeah,
I think
please, Wayne.
I think, Todd, it's just a lot of this is, at the organizational level, as you're there are sort of these cascading sort of purposes, in terms of where you engage in that, right? But organizations are fundamentally made up of human beings. So it's that sort of, you can't sort of take a purpose statement from on high and just deliver it to the masses. It is about sort of building those conversations, getting the feedback, hearing those voices, it's more than just sort of making sure people are heard. It's about sort of integrating voices so that, you are getting that resonance when sort of you're getting that alignment. I think part of the power of the concept is that ideally you get to some kind of there's a kickoff point to it, but, there's a self-sustaining aspect to it. So when people are clear on their purpose, it's easier for them to apply that to their work, apply that to people that they work with, apply it to their organization and their teams.
Declan, that builds on a point that I think was actually one of the biggest learnings for me between the research to the podcast. So when we were writing the research, I did it with Karina Freitag, who's actually now coincidentally at EY, and how we made the connection for that podcast. And I remember talking to her towards the end, and I said, do we think that purpose is driven from the top, or that can it come from the bottom? And at the time, this was towards the end of the research project, she said, I don't think you can do it unless it comes from the top. And I was fascinated by that, that perspective, because I'm generally kind of a top down and bottom up type of person. But I think there's something to be said there. So I know we got a question, and I'm just going to grab this one real quick, Todd, around purpose versus mission was one of the questions we got in there. And in the research, we defined purpose as why I or we do this. So just that fundamental concept. And mission being what we do now and in the future. So a little bit different. And so if you go back to that point, do you need leaders to define why we do this? I think to some extent, maybe to articulate it, but there's probably a purpose that's in there. I think Chris, Rachel, Victor might have mentioned that there was already purpose in the organization. It was just the articulation of it after the Business Roundtable statement. And so what I think that was so interesting, though, is it's nice to have the articulation. This is my learning after all these podcasts and the research. It's nice to have the articulation, but purpose can exist in pockets. I think Aaron Hurst said that. Purpose can exist in pockets, in products, and different areas. And so there's an opportunity and a role for anyone to potentially build on it, even if it's at just your team level. But it's nice to also have the leadership from the top. But that thinking for me was radically different than where we started at the beginning of the research.
I think of it as a little bit different. It's not an either or. But I've been desperate for a way to find a way in to disagree with Stacia on something. But I loved, again, the EY guys talked about this golden thread, not a red thread, a golden thread. Yeah. And I think of purpose as the glue that holds a collection of people together. And I think you can have, I did some separate work we didn't cover in this particular podcast series with the International Red Cross. And they bring 11 million people as volunteers together. And they basically do it by teaching, by teaching them how to do very important work that's needed in sort of crises. And so I think of purpose as this glue that binds people together. Leaders can definitely have an outsized role in providing that story, that glue, but everybody has to buy in and everybody contributes. I think that's what was really interesting to me. It's definitely not something that you outsource to your leadership. Also, Dan Pontefract, who's done a lot of writing on the topic, sort of talked about, again, this nested purpose idea, but he said, one of the most important things that HR can do is help people get that alignment right between their role, themselves, and their organization. But I love this idea of the glue that binds people together. It's very powerful when you start thinking about constituents that are outside of the organization. And we're starting to see examples of learning teams, L&D teams, EY was one of them, that are using learning to engage stakeholders that actually exist outside of the employee base. And I think that's very much a part of the future.
Yeah, maybe this is a perfect, I'd love to, I think we've got this. We can play the Clint Coffert clip from, who heads up the Global Institute for Human Performance at J&J, and talking about, bringing out, the role of L&D, bringing out the best in all of us. So let's hear this. Then I'm going to put a question, a great one that came in the Q&A, back to the group.
That's probably part of the goal of any learning professional, really, is to take what are the unique assets and capabilities that come with an organization, and harnessing all of that to really bring to life the best of that organization. Certainly very fortunate that purpose has those deep roots at Johnson & Johnson.
Let me ask this, because this is a little challenging. So one of this came in a bit anonymously, which I will not divulge who here, but how do you address leaders that think individually they are purpose-driven? I don't know if...
Well, I guess the question is inherent in the question is they think they are purpose-driven, but they're not really? Or
That's how I'm reading it. Hopefully I've got that right. Anonymous submitter.
Yeah. So, I think that that's a good start, right? Whether they're actually making it happen or not, that vision of being purpose driven is a good start for folks. And the question is, how do you, one, create some scaffolding and some learning for them to understand what that means for them, and then to translate that for their team, right? And so I think that the clarity around, what is purpose? How can purpose